All right, you did it. Hi, hello again. My name is Matthew Fluharty. I'm the director of Art of the Rural, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all today and to share a little bit of our work. And I'm just going to kind of dive into it here and just kind of really quickly talk about some of the things that we have been up to at Art of the Rural. A little background. Art of the Rural, I mentioned that I had kind of suffered through a PhD in English literature. Art of the Rural began as a blog project about 4 years ago, which was really, in essence, a way to think beyond the university about the issues that were happening in contemporary art and culture, in particular in rural arts and culture. I think one of the issues that we think a lot about at Art of the Rural, those of us who are kind of engaged with the academy on one shape or form or another, is the responsibility of people in universities to engage with people beyond universities. And Art of the Rural really kind of came out of that impulse and that imperative. Art of the Rural is a collaborative organization. On one hand, we want to help build the field of the rural arts. As you all probably know, there is a lot of arts and cultural production happening. It's not unified, and there just isn't like a news organ for the work that's happening out there. People don't know, people even in the same region of a state don't know what's happening just across the county or on the other side of a major city. So one of the main missions of Art of the Rural is to make that visible and to build that field, to ask, what questions are at stake? Is there a canon? What are the texts? What are the projects which can kind of shape the direction of our work as it engages with rural culture, but also with urban culture as well, because there is a continuum between those two things. So we're interested in creating new narratives on all of that, and really helping however we can in collaboration with folks push forward this sort of emerging rural arts and culture movement, bless you, which is kind of beginning to take shape. This is our new website. It just launched 2 or 3 days ago. I really like it. I have like very little web skill, and we were on Blogger for ages, but we moved over to WordPress. So I love looking at that. I wanted, since Art of the Rural is sort of a little bit more of, it's kind of an amorphous project on one level. I wanted to kind of just give some context, because I think this is important to kind of contextualize what we're doing, and I think in particular the ways that we're trying to do it. This is a picture from the Rural Arts and Culture Working Group, which met last summer at Double Edge Theater in Western Massachusetts. Really fantastic laboratory theater project I know a lot of folks would be interested in. Art of the Rural is one of the co-conveners of this event, where we had folks truly from all kind of aspects of the arts and culture landscape. Art collectives were there. Folks who were doing sort of culture and agricultural projects, all the way up to sort of people from the large national institutions, and bringing those people together to have conversation. So I wanted just to offer a little bit of context about rural America, and not to dwell too long on these amazing slides, but just to kind of show some of the things that are at stake with some of rural America, which you can't pigeonhole it any one way or another. It's a very fluid landscape. This first figure here, I don't know if the text is all that visible from where you all are sitting, is the familiar narrative. It's about population change in rural America. Even many of our most responsible news organizations, the narrative about rural America is that people are leaving it. And that's accurate. If you see sort of the red shades, that is a population loss. But there's also a lot of population gain. That would be sort of the magenta and the blue and the green. So depending on where y'all are coming from, you can get a sense of sort of the shifting dynamics in your region of the country. The main problem with rural America, I think, is that popularly it is thought of as a place that is in stasis, socially but also aesthetically. And that's not the case, and that's part of our mission at Art of the Rural. So rural America is 80% of the geographic mass of the United States, and it's 25% of the population, depending on how you sort of figure those numbers, and you can figure them in any wild sorts of configurations. There are 15 federal definitions for what rural even means. It's just a really fluid term. If you look at rural communities which are in urban counties, this number gets closer to 30%. Oh, yeah. My slide, I think part of it got cut off. But our vision of rural America, I think, is based on what rural America was in the 50s, where it was a larger portion of the population, and close to half of those people were farmers. That's no longer the case. Only 20% of those folks in 2012 who are rural live on farms. And the part that is cut off in this slide is that 90% of farm income comes from off farms. So what that means, essentially, is that there is a social and economic continuum between rural America and the urban areas within that periphery. Rural America is just intricately linked to urban and suburban sites. That's often overlooked. I didn't put the audio in for this because I didn't want it to sort of thunder and scare everyone. But one of the things that we really think about at Art of the Rural is how we figure that rural-urban continuum. And a great example is, of course, now the most famous installation artist in the world, Jay-Z, his song, The Takeover. And what's beautiful about that song is that when they had to do the rights to clear that song, they kind of went back from, if you look at the bottom where the takeover is, they went back and back and back and back. And the musical structure that made up the samples of that song, the predominant musical sample, was a song called Rosie, which Alan Lomax recorded at the Parchman Farm prison in the late 30s, I believe. And what I like about this is a great metaphor for how rural and urban places are linked. I think they're inextricably linked, and oftentimes the suburbs get in the way of visualizing those links. And I love this as kind of just like an intellectual flow chart. What I love about this too, since we're in New Orleans and I'm coming from St. Louis, is that you have like just a very visual sort of a vertical line that is kind of like a river itself, which is one of the other elements that we think a lot about, and we were actually just talking about, which is this continuum between rural and urban space was played out over the last 200 years with the diaspora, which moved from south to north and then all over the place. So this kind of progression here, you can find all sorts of social analogs for that. So that was my Jay-Z interlude there. But the most misunderstood, or I think just like element of sort of like our rural context, which isn't covered enough, is how diverse rural America is becoming. It's becoming more diverse at a rate faster than urban America. And if you look at this fantastic social science chart, you can kind of see here that the grayed out areas are the urban counties. So that's not figured into this, but you can see how communities of color are increasingly the face of rural America. That's not discussed enough, but that's the reality of the situation. We're going to have, I think, as artists and critics and writers, we're going to be in this situation in about 20 years where the popular face of rural America in no way correlates to what is actually happening in rural America. And part of our mission is to illuminate and elucidate what's really happening there. So rural America is growing much slower than urban America. Just 22 million people added, thanks to the numbers from the last census. But people of color accounted for 83% of that growth. So we're in a really dynamic and fluid situation now, and we're at a spot where the arts and cultural production coming out of rural America is beginning to express that, and it's deeply exciting. Just a couple numbers here to close out the contextual part of this. 12%, I mentioned earlier that rural America is, give or take, 30% of the population, 25 to 30%, depending on how you want to swing that. Only 12% of the nation's arts nonprofits are in rural America. So we're facing tremendous roadblocks in terms of access and equity across the board, and the arts are no exception to that. 1%, it's a great sort of cultural number for so many reasons after the Occupy movement. If we're thinking about funding and the kind of the funding network situation that we're in right now, only 1% of the philanthropy that is dispersed in America goes to rural America. And if you think about that, that's staggering. It's a staggering sort of inequity that we see, in our philanthropic realm. So much so that if it had been equitable last year, rural America would have received $28 billion more than they did. And that 1% is for everything. I mean, rural America needs roads, they need healthcare, they need broadband, they need so many things. And the arts is just a portion of that. So that's one of the large structural problems that we're facing at Art of the Rural, and that we also try to discuss. I want to segue real quickly. Maybe perhaps we'll talk about M12 in our discussion as this continues. But I'm also really proud to be a member of the M12, which is an art collective based in the High Plains of Colorado, just sort of northeast of Denver, maybe about an hour northeast in the town of Byers. What we come up against, I think, as a culture of artists who are engaging with rural places, is that you have all those numbers that I just described, which are overwhelming and staggering. But then you have the artistic spirit, which wants to do something with that. And M12, I think, is a great example of an organization in which I think, to kind of dance between a lot of the ideas that are being discussed there, thinks about responsible community engagement, thinks about social practice, but also thinks about making aesthetically adventurous work. So one of the projects I really like, just real briefly, that I could return to is the Black Hornet Project, which is up there in the top left. There's a strong racing culture in Colorado, and so M12 designed a race car, partnered with a family, I think fourth generation family of race car drivers. The current driver of the Black Hornet car there in the top left is 12 years old, and he's currently being documented. I think he's finished second or third in a couple races. I can go on about that later. But yeah, maybe I'll come back to the M12. I think as a model for a way of being, it's greatly informed our process at Art of the Rural. So I'm on the board of directors technically at M12, but I'm just part of the M12. As a collective, I think, we don't see a lot of division between that. So I help conceptualize projects. I help collaborate. I do work on the sites in Colorado when I can. So we just work together however we can. And that's really informed Art of the Rural's practice. We're an organization where I think collaboration is the major element of our thinking. And collaborating across all boundaries with artists, with cultural workers, with communities, with universities, in the kind of interdisciplinary ways that a lot of folks are talking about. I think that's just so essential that we think in those terms. So, we have a website, and on that website, if folks are interested later, we have a project called the Atlas of Rural Arts and Culture, which is beginning to try to do the work of visually mapping what's out there in terms of the rural arts, but also in terms of the points where there are rural-urban connections. And because, for about 3 years, Art of the Rural was just a blog project, I think the one thing that we really thought about when we began to sort of do the work of working with rural communities is to kind of instantly become dissatisfied with digital media on one level, and thinking about how digital processes can have analog components to them. And the way that we sort of frame that is that, we have this sort of massive atlas project that we're working on, and that's fine. That could be a resource. People would be happy with that, but that's simply not enough. We need to use that as a roadmap to build real consortium in regions and within fields. And we have a project in the West right now that's beginning to do that, where the map is sort of a pathway for informal discussion across the region. We're also working on an imprint, kind of along those same lines, taking ideas and concepts that we might be gathering digitally, but making them real and making them physical in such a way that they can actually go to these rural communities. So this is our organizational map. I mean, this is really the spirit of the M12. The one thing that we really think about, that we've thought a lot about as Art of the Rural has kind of moved forward, you look at those numbers about sort of the state of rural America right now, it's that way because of broad structural cultural hierarchies. And I think this could really be another point of commonality between a lot of our projects, is that if those hierarchies aren't serving us in our communities, in our practice, in our artistic communities, we need to build models as organizations which refuse those hierarchies. And that's the kind of structure that we've developed at Art of the Rural, where, this is my beautiful, we needed an organizational map, and this is like how we sort of did it, where you have something that isn't vertical, but it's horizontal and it's circular. Where maybe we are engaging with regional and national arts agencies, but that work goes back to communities, and feedback from communities and artists informs how we communicate to those folks. so that this is sort of our ecosystem at Art of the Rural. So we are really thinking about sort of the interconnected ways that artists and cultural workers can engage to move narratives forward, but also to work on projects, to work across disciplines. What do we have next here? So this is just a little glimpse of the Atlas of Rural Arts and Culture, which folks can find through the Art of the Rural website. And this is just probably a better way of describing what I just mentioned earlier, where, I think one of the challenges that we have is that, we're working with specific communities, but we're really thinking about rural America as a whole as well. And the challenge with that is that there's massive geographic space between all of these sites and locations. And so really thinking about a digital platform that can try to collapse that in a way where folks are communicating with each other and also communicating with urban people as well, which I think is absolutely essential. And out of that, really bridging human relationships. I think that's the end game for so much of this, is making change on the ground and making something that's sustainable for the future. This is our last slide. This is on the way to visit West Jackson at the Land Institute in Chicago, in Salina, Kansas. A little visual metaphor for some of our work. But that's my tour through Art of the Rural's practice. I'd really love to continue this in the Q&A, but thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.